Jeff Fuhrer is Executive Vice President and Senior Policy Advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Jeff has spoken here before. Many of you have met him. He does an excellent job. His credentials are outstanding, and he asked me to give you the short version of the bio. But he has been with the Federal Reserve Bank since June of 1992. He has moved up and through various responsibilities there over the years and is now, as I mentioned, Executive Vice President and Senior Policy Advisor. He has been active in economic research for more than 2 decades. He served as an associate editor for the American Economic Review, published numerous papers on interactions among monetary policy, inflation, consumer spending, and asset prices. Jeff has an AB in economics from Princeton University and received his MA and PhD in economics from Harvard. So please join me in welcoming Jeff Fuhrer.
Well, thank you for that introduction. It's great to be here this afternoon. We just made it into afternoon. Yeah. And I want to thank you especially for feeding me before I talk, because sometimes that doesn't happen, and then I just spend the whole time like looking at your food and going, wow, I'm going to, So I appreciate that. This is an interesting time. I have to say that since 2007, so coming up on almost 10 years ago, it has been fascinating and scary sometimes and challenging to work at the Federal Reserve. The economy just never stops changing. The upheaval, the crises just keep on coming. The unexpected keeps occurring. And we're going to talk about some of that this morning. I want to emphasize that I put some slides together because I am a type A person, and I am pretty organized, and so they will make sense and they will proceed in semi-linear fashion. But I really would, we have time for questions. I really want to emphasize that you should please ask questions about whatever you are interested in. I mean, not, like Britney Spears, but I mean, whatever on the economic sphere, regional, national, or global, that you have an interest in. Because one, it makes it more interesting for me, and that's most important. But it also makes it, I think, more interesting for everybody else in the audience. We'll touch on some topics that are most important to you, so that would be great if you'd ask questions. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about what's changed over the 10 years or so. So I'm going to talk about a sort of a new normal for the economy, just to set expectations for what kinds of things will happen that are normal, and that's different from what was the case before. So there's some of those things that are listed there, and I'm going to talk about them in more detail in a second. I'm going to talk in particular about why we've had slow growth for a little while, even though we've recovered in many senses from the Great Recession that started in late 2007 and went through 2009. And really, the slow recovery has extended up to the present time. Why is that? Why so slow? Talk about the causes of that. Talk about the fact that we're likely to be living in an environment with relatively low interest rates. That is not to say that the federal funds rate will be at 0 forever, but I mean that in general, we will be living in a relatively low interest rate environment. I want to talk a little bit about that, why that is the case and why it matters. And then obviously I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications of that for policy, especially the policy that I'm involved in, which is monetary policy. And then I want to spend a little time talking about what to think about the economy in the aftermath of the election. Because, no matter who had won, there were policies that the two candidates had in mind. And so President-elect Trump had some policies in mind that he's talked about. Those do have implications for the economy. We don't know enough about many of them to say too much, but we know enough about some of them to say something. So that's what I'm going to do, is say something. Okay. So just first to calibrate, this is a chart that you're going to learn to love, I think, even though it may not be obvious at first what it is. This is showing you what is the average growth in GDP during a recovery that follows a recession. The average is in the black line, and you can see that it goes up to something like 5, 6, 7, even 8% on average, at least for the few quarters at the beginning of the recovery, and remains somewhat elevated for some period after that, 4%, sometimes 5%. That's a significant growth rate. The red line shows you what happened during this recovery, and it's just much lower than the average. And in fact, it defines the lower bound for some of the quarters following the end of the recession. And the recession officially ended in the second quarter of 2009, although it hasn't really felt like that for many of the quarters following it. And part of the reason is that the growth rate has been so slow. The gray area just shows you that apart from the most recent experience, what has been the range of experiences. And again, just to say, we're definitely at the low end of the range of all experience since 1947. Okay, so that is a fact. We'll come back to why that is, but that's just a fact first. It has been a slow growth recovery. Nonetheless, during that recovery, the unemployment rate, again shown in the red line here, the most recent experience, the unemployment rate fell quite smartly. That is, it was as high as 10% at the worst points of the recession in 2009, and then today it's just below 5%. So you compare that to a few other recessions, which are shown in different colored lines in that graph. They didn't have nearly as severe a recession. The unemployment rate was not nearly as high as it was during this recession. But we got back to the 5% level at about the same horizon, so obviously that means that the actual decline year by year was even more rapid. So that's an interesting juxtaposition, right? We had slow growth. It averaged about 2.1% during the recovery, so the 7 years, a little more than 7 years of the recovery. You might have thought with 2.1% growth you wouldn't make that much progress in terms of improving labor markets because it doesn't seem like very rapid growth. But in fact, we did quite well in terms of the unemployment rate. So that's another interesting fact. However, it is the case that the share of the population that's actually employed has not reattained its pre-recession level. Again, that's the red line. It's improved somewhat, for sure, but it is not back where it was, right? So knowing about unemployment is good. There are fewer people unemployed, but that doesn't mean everybody who might be employed is employed. So that's going to give us a clue about where to look for why that happened. And what it must say, it turns out, is it says something about who's coming in and out of the labor force, who's actually entering the labor force looking for work and then ultimately becoming employed. So let's see what that means. Why do I say that? The reason I say that is because there are really only two ways that unemployment can fall, and they're kind of summarized in this chart. Either the folks who are unemployed can become employed, and that's usually a good thing, or the unemployed can leave the labor force, right? They can give up, stop looking for work, and not be counted in the labor force. And the big pie chart there just shows you that, fortunately, among the working age population, the bulk of people are in the green slice, the green cheese wedge, which is they're employed, 152 million of them as of last month. And another slug are people who are not in the labor force. But there are people who are not in the labor force, by and large, for lots of good reasons. And I'll give you a little detail on that in a second. But, there are people who are not looking for work because they're taking care of folks at home, either kids or parents, or they're retired, or they're pursuing education, which is a fine thing to be doing. So we'll look at how many of the folks who are not in the labor force might be folks who would come back into the labor force looking for work. There are some, not loads. And then about 7.8 million, or 4.9% of the population, is unemployed. So just to say, we saw the unemployment rate fall. We like to see some of those folks going back to become employed. We also have to track what's going on with people who are coming in and out of the labor force, because that's also going to affect what's happening to the unemployment rate. Right? So we saw unemployment dropped. We saw employment had not recovered fully, so that has to mean then that people left the labor force, and we call that a lower participation rate. It just means fewer people who could be actively participating in the labor market. Fewer people are than could be the case. All right, so that's what happened. And in fact, if you look at the labor force participation rate, which is just the share of people who are in the labor force from the working age population, that has been trending down, right? So there it is. That goes from 1980 to the present. You can see that since somewhere in the late 1990s, that number has been going down. Why is that? Why would there be fewer people participating in the labor force? Well, the answer is because we're getting older. All of us, actually, hopefully. It's a good thing. It's better to get older than not. Right, the alternative is not as much fun, although we don't know. Maybe it is. Who knows? But it depends on who you ask. But still, from my perspective anyway, I'm 59, and I'm still thinking it'd be good to stay alive rather than not. So we are aging, and as people get older, they tend to participate less in the labor force. So it's just a natural consequence of having an aging labor force. There are going to be less people working. So that's not a bad thing. That trend actually just continued right through the recession. You can see the onset of the recession is marked by that line. And so the demographic part of it is not too concerning. That's part of what was going on. It was sort of masked by the fact that we had this enormous recession, but it was a trend that started before that. Okay. Just to show you what some of the underlying demographic trends are, so the top line shows you what's happening to what are called prime age males. So apparently I'm past prime age, which makes me feel a little bit, insecure. But if you're between 25 and 54, a prime age male, that participation rate has been dropping for quite some time. And then in the bottom panel, you can see that the share of the labor force now that's, say, between 55 and 65 has not surprisingly been rising. That's what it means for us to be aging. We're getting older, and their participation rate is lower. That's on the right-hand scale. It's around 40% versus the average participation rate for prime age males, which is much higher than that. So again, that's just to decompose and explain sort of the obvious, that as we get older, we are participating less in the labor force, so the overall participation rate goes down, and that is a good part of the reason for why unemployment actually fell, because the participation rate was falling. Okay, so now what's interesting is just more recently, that's a trend that, as I said, extended back to the late 90s through the recession, but just in the last year, things have been a little bit different. So if you can see at the end of that chart, the unemployment rate basically over the last year has been pretty much flat, somewhere around 4.9 or 5%. It's blipped around a little bit, a little up, a little down here and there, but it's been pretty constant. And what's happened during that time is, contrary to the trend up to that point, the participation rate, the number of people who are in the labor force, actually has gone up, okay? And so we've had good employment growth during that period, but we've had more people enter the labor force at the same time. And so that's roughly offset the good effect of increased employment. Just had more people coming back in looking for jobs. Those are all okay. We actually like to see people re-entering the labor force because it's a sign that the labor market is healthy enough that people come back to look for and then actually in most cases get jobs. So that's what happened. So that's why the unemployment rate has been kind of stable for the last year. And an important question for us in the monetary policy business is, well, is the unemployment rate likely to remain stable, or will it continue to go down? Because at some point, there's an unemployment rate that's probably not sustainable. It'll start to put pressure on wages and inflation that's not going to be healthy for the economy, or start to put pressure on other aspects of the economy. Maybe it'll show up in financial markets, that we'll start to see bubble-like stuff going on. But one way or another, if you get too far past sort of full employment, things start to sow the seeds of their own demise. So that's the question, is it going to stay like that? Do we think it can stay stable? And that depends on whether we can expect to see more people coming back into the labor force, right? We've seen pretty steady job growth all along. The thing that stopped the unemployment rate from going down further is that people started entering the labor force. If that continues, we'll stay stable in terms of unemployment. If it does not continue, then with steady job growth, the unemployment rate will drop, and at some point get beyond the point that is sustainable. So what do I think about that? So let's look at the people who are out of the labor force now to try to assess whether they're likely to come back in or not. And as I said, there's lots of people in the labor force. You can see the big green bar on the left there, who do not want a job because they're doing something perfectly reasonable. It's just not leading to employment, right? And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. So the vast majority of people who are not in the labor force are not likely to come back into the labor force. And then of those who want a job, that's 5.8 million of the 94.5 million. I think I added those right. You can check me later, but anyway, it looks like that. Of the total, 5.8 million say they want a job, but of those, 3.4 million didn't look for work at any time in the previous year. So saying they want a job but not exerting any effort over the course of the year to look for a job may mean that they are less likely to. I've just been disbarred from this association. Apparently, my badge. We were talking earlier about this. What I can't understand is why we've had these stick-on name tags for 39 years now, but the stick-em stuff doesn't actually really stick to cloth. It's like when they finally awoke 20 years ago and said, why are we licking the backs of postage stamps to put them on? Why don't we make a sticker that goes onto paper, like we put on bananas for the last 100 years, say? And so they finally figured that out. Someday, someone will figure out how to make a stick-em for the back of these that actually sticks on what it's intended to stick on. Anyway, I'm going to put it here for now. It may stay better there. That's me. So just to say, of the many people who are out of the labor force, those who have searched for a job in the previous year, not in the previous 4 weeks, because if they had searched, this is a little technical, but it's true, if they had searched in the preceding 4 weeks, they would be counted as unemployed. Right, that's actually how it's defined. You don't have a job, but you have to have been looking sometime in the last 4 weeks, and if you have, you're counted as unemployed. If you haven't looked at all, you still make the statistic there second from the left as you looked for, so you make the statistic furthest on the right there. You looked in the last year, but you're out of the labor force. You're not counted as unemployed. But we still care about those people, of course, because maybe they can be employed. So let's look at them in a little bit more detail, and that's what the next chart does. And it says, of those people who searched in the previous year, but maybe not in the very recent past, there are a bunch of things going on. Discouraged over job prospects is one possibility. So if you're discouraged over job prospects and the labor market improves, you may go back and look again, right? And you may actually find a job. So that's a group of people, 550,000, who may come back into the labor force. But there are other things going on among this group as well. Family responsibilities, they're going to school, they are suffering from ill health, they're working in child care, their own child care, or they're not available to work for some other reason. That's most of the other people. Now, I don't want to draw too fine a distinction across these categories because this is a phone survey. It's very carefully done, and it's been quite accurate for many years. However, we don't know exactly what's going on with all of those people, but just to say, there's a limited number of folks who may come back into the labor force plausibly, not zero. I would still be happy to see some of these folks come back and find work if that's what they want to do. But many of them are not going to look for work. So just say there's some limit to the number of folks who might come back into the labor force, and therefore, if we continue to see the kind of job growth that we've seen right up until the most recent report from last month, then probably the unemployment rate will slip down a little bit further because we won't see that kind of flow into the labor force that offsets the people who are becoming employed from within the labor force. All right? So that's what's that about, all of which is to say we probably have a little bit more run room to go. We can probably, I think, still have somewhat stimulative monetary policy for a while that will maintain some growth, that'll continue to produce pretty healthy job growth, bring maybe some people back into the labor force. Over time, though, that's likely to move the unemployment rate lower, and there's a limit to that. We're not at that limit now, I don't think, but we're close enough that we need to be watching that. So that's my sense. Okay, so that's more about the labor market than you ever have known before, but now you can amaze and delight your friends at a cocktail party by telling them about labor force participation and where it's going to go. So now the question turns to why growth has been so slow. That was the first question I raised at the beginning of my remarks here. And the answer is primarily it's slower productivity growth. So where does growth come from? By and large, it comes from two things. We have more people working. If there are more people working, more stuff gets made, unless they're doing absolutely nothing, and that hasn't happened in most of my jobs. So we can have more people working, or they can make more for every hour that they work, and making more for every hour that you work is exactly what productivity growth means, that you're getting more efficient, more productive. Okay. So over the grand span of history, the solid heavy green line there says that on average in the U.S. over about 100 years, we've averaged about a little over 2% productivity growth. That's a product of all kinds of innovations. If you go back that far, there's all kinds of things going on, right? From rural electrification to water purification to very early computer technology being introduced to more recent technology being introduced. All that kind of stuff is going on. The healthcare stuff is not the least of it. That matters a lot. But in any event, that's produced an average growth rate of 2%. Recently, that means over the last 5 years or the last year or whatever you want, but recently, it's been about 0.5% average productivity growth in the U.S. economy. So that's much slower. Okay, so the question there is, well, is that a temporary phenomenon? Is that something that comes out of the recession, which we won't have to live with for too much longer? Or is that something that's going to be with us for a while? And the answer is we don't know. What we do know is that there's probably some effect of the recession on risk-taking, on formation of new businesses, on some aspects of innovation, and therefore investment in new technologies that contributes to that kind of productivity growth. That should be temporary, we hope. That is the case. There's a strand of thought that says, there's an economist from Northwestern named Robert Gordon, who's a very smart guy, but he's a little bit pessimistic for my taste. He says, all of the good inventions, really, and the major ones have happened, and that's the way it goes. We're done. And not that other things won't happen. Trust me, you will get more apps on your iPhone or your Samsung exploding phone, but you will. That's not really fair to Samsung. That's so sad for their company. Samsung makes really good phones, right? They have for years and other products, and one of their phones explodes and burns, and they're in trouble. Anyway, you will almost surely have new apps on your iPhone But it is fair to say that the increment to productivity from another app on your iPhone is smaller than, say, the discovery of the laser, right? Which is all over communications and data storage and stuff now in ways that they didn't even anticipate when they started bouncing coherent light waves back and forth between two mirrors back in the 1940s or 50s, whenever that was. I studied lasers at one point. It's pretty cool. Anyway, I made a hologram. I have made a hologram. How many of you, can you say that? How many of you made a hologram in your life? I made a hologram in high school as a physics project, and it was so much fun because there was like this little, it was a little toy locomotive, and it's just like floating out there in three-dimensional space, and I said, wow, we made a hologram. And my physics professor said, I'm keeping it. You can't take that with me. That's way too cool for you to take with you. So I don't have it anymore. But anyway, so the idea is that all these major technological advances have happened. So electrification, right? Public health things all happen. We're just not going to make those kinds of improvements going forward. That's Robert Gordon. I don't really believe that. I think, you know, Robert Gordon has thought a lot about technology and innovation, and so he probably knows more about some aspects of it than I do. But I do think that there are areas where we could make incredible progress. So, for example, energy, you know, this isn't about politics or whatever. This is about technology. We rely on fossil fuels for producing still most of our energy. Now, you can love them or not love them. You can even be a coal miner if you want. That's fine with me. But they only will last for so long, and they do have external, they cause external harm to the environment. The person who comes up with the scalable, economically viable energy source that replaces fossil fuels is going to make trillions of dollars, but more importantly, is going to transform the way we do everything, not just in this country, but in all of the developed countries around the world. That is a huge thing. That matters enormously. And when that happens, and we don't know when it will happen, there are people obviously working on it now, and there are some substitute technologies, but when that happens, that's going to be a big change in all of the economies around the world. Another thing that matters a lot is healthcare for people, especially in developed economies. And the thing that matters for the United States, which we have to choose to do something about, it doesn't happen automatically, and the market doesn't solve it, is if we educate all of our population to the level that I or some of the people in this room are educated or something approximating that, that will also change the way the world looks. We have lots of people in the country and in the state of New Hampshire who are not as well educated and don't have the skills that they will need to actively participate in the economy going forward. We got to do something about that. That should be a first-order priority. There are ways of addressing it, but first, focusing on it as a national priority that is bipartisan, I think should be done. So anyway, just to say, I don't think we're stuck at 0.5% productivity growth forever. I think there are lots of opportunities, some of them from the private sector, some of them from long-term research in the public sector, some of them from providing good public and private education to all the citizens of the country that will change that productivity line. So I think we'll get back up to 2%. We will see. If I'm wrong 10 years from now, you should come and, like, you know, throw rocks at my house. And you can say, you were so wrong about this, I can't believe you misled us. There are some temporary factors as well. I talked about one, sort of the investment and business formation in the wake of the recession. But in addition, there are sectors of the economy that have been relatively slow. So one is government spending. Earlier in the recovery, especially, we had a little burst early on, and then both at the federal and the state and local level, government spending was subtracting. Those little bars are below the zero line, so they're subtracting from GDP growth. That's what that chart means. And then more recently, they've started to look like a bit of a help or a neutral influence. So that's good. But during a lot of the recovery, that was just an influence that slowed the economy down, other things equal. And then the red bars are the contribution that comes from net exports, and largely that's about the rest of the world not recovering as well as we did. And so partly because they didn't buy as many of our exports, partly because our strength meant our exchange rate appreciated and made our exports more expensive. For both reasons, net exports were a drag on a good part of the recovery. So those are some of the reasons temporarily that growth was slower. But in addition, there's this more persistent underlying source, which is productivity growth, which again I am long-term optimistic about, but in the short run, it's a bit of a challenge. Okay. So interestingly, the fact that we and other countries around the world have been growing slow has led to low interest rates. And there's actually two kind of different reasons for this. One is that central banks around the world, the counterparts of the Federal Reserve around the world, have kept rates low because when growth is slow, they try to stimulate the economy to get it back to full employment, back to normal, so they don't have to keep doing that. So that's the case. And so rates have been low for that reason. But it also looks like it's related to the slow productivity growth. It looks like the sort of long-run underlying inflation-adjusted or real rates of interest are lower now than they were earlier in this millennium. And so again, that's partly about productivity, and that may change if productivity growth indeed does rebound over time. But for the moment, that's likely to be the case, that we'll have somewhat lower interest rates on average than we had prior to this recession. I'm just showing you the German rates there, which are the blue and the green lines. Those are inflation-adjusted rates, meaning I subtract inflation from the nominal rate to get the real rate. The red line is the nominal 10-year German yield, which is below zero. That's pretty low, right? So ours is at 2.34, 2.36%, depending on which hour you look recently. But they're, in nominal terms, their rates are zero. So that says there's something very depressed about that economy, not very productive, not very high productivity growth, and that's interesting. But anyway, why does that matter for monetary policy? Well, so, look, the markets now have a 96.3% probability on have placed a 96.3% probability on an interest rate increase at the December FOMC meeting, which is just in a couple of weeks. So that doesn't mean it's going to happen, but they think it's going to happen. Okay, so that's part of a process whereby the Fed will maybe gradually raise interest rates a little bit over time. That's what they've said they're likely to do. It's all contingent on the way the world actually works, but that's what they've said they're going to do. So that's good, but then where are they going to end up? You actually have to have some kind of goal in mind. You can't just say, well, we'll just keep raising until we forget to raise again or something. No, we are going somewhere, a place where we think the interest rate will be neither restraining the economy nor stimulating it, so a roughly neutral rate. So just to show you that because of this low interest rate environment, the people who set monetary policy, my boss and the other folks who do this down in Washington, they have changed where they think the federal funds rate is going to end up just over the last couple of years, even less. They used to think it would be at least 3.75%. Prior to that, they were in the 4.25%, 4.5% range. They thought it was going to be that high. Now they're saying, 2.75% is about as high as we're going to get. That's a significant change. That means we don't have as far to go to raise interest rates. So there's not as much of a rush. There's not a great urgency. And so I think for that reason, what we're looking at is likely, when the rates increases come, the 96% chance in December, or whatever happens after that, likely to be quite gradual, because we don't have that far to go. We do have some distance to go before we reach a neutral stance, but not as far as we might have thought prior to the recession. So just a few quick points on recent data. Employment growth has still been good. We're actually getting another employment report on Friday at 8:30 a.m., so keep tuned for that. Do you guys get that live feed, everybody? Anybody? Nobody? Oh, you've got to see the employment report. It's so cool. I love the employment report. Very important information. You should get it delivered direct to your homes live. Anyway, up till the most recent employment report, we're still growing at a very healthy rate of growth. 180,000 jobs net per month over the last few months. And that is, importantly, that's well above the number that is needed just to absorb the people who are entering the labor force for completely normal life cycle reasons, meaning, right, people age, they get past 18, 22, college, or whatever their degree is, and then they go to look for a job. There's a certain number of people like that coming into the labor force every month. That number is somewhere around 80 to 100,000, not more than that. And so to absorb those folks, to create the jobs that those folks need, we want to create net 80 to 100,000 jobs a month, something like that. Well, we're doing in excess of that by a good margin every month, and that accumulates to a good net job growth that has pulled people out of the labor force and has certainly reduced the ranks of the unemployed to date. We'd like to see some more of that continue. There's a point at which you can't just keep doing that forever. If we start growing at 100,000 jobs per month at some point in the next year or two, that's probably fine. It means everybody who's more or less who's getting a job. Sorry, NHPR, I just whacked your microphone. Is that live, or are you just recording, or what's happening? No, I think the clip's okay. I'm just going to adjust this a little bit now. This is what I'm a microphone guy anyway, so okay. So good-looking news on the labor market, and we're doing more than we need to for the kind of long-run steady state. GDP growth also looked pretty good. Actually, we just got a number. I sent you the slides on Monday. The number came out yesterday. This number for GDP was revised up from 2.9 to 3.3%, so that's even better than we thought. Some of that was boosted temporarily by the fact that a lot of manufacturers thought that the shelves were not quite so full of goods as they should be, so they were restocking inventories. They'd gotten a little lean, so they did that. That's what that green wedge says. And also trade, and interestingly, this is the first time I've ever really had to talk about soybeans at any length in one of these talks, but it is a fact that soybean exports accounted for a large surge in exports in the third quarter of 2016. You know, you just don't usually have to say that because soybeans, while I like soybeans, I think they're a good source of protein and all that, I just don't usually have to say much about them because, you know, they get grown and people eat them and that's all there is to say. But it turns out there were some crop failures other places in the world. We ended up exporting more soybeans than we usually do, and that actually showed up in the statistics, right, in a way that soybeans never do. Okay. Very brief word on it. Anyway, so the recent growth number, pretty good. Probably a little higher than you're likely to see for the next couple of quarters because it was sort of temporarily boosted by some things, but there's some underlying good growth there. Consumer spending still seems to be doing pretty good. Inflation up till now had been stubbornly low, below 2%, but now it looks like it's rising back up maybe towards 2%. 2% actually is our official goal for inflation. We can talk about why it's not 0 or 4, but that is the goal that was announced a few years back. And so we're getting close. It's at 1.7% on a core basis or sort of a trend basis, and the overall measure is also rising up towards that as well. So we're getting close to that goal as well. I don't know how many of you know that the Fed has a dual mandate. Anybody know that? It's true. Did you know that? Okay, so we do. So you knew. We have a dual mandate, which is part of our congressional charter that says there are two things we need to worry about. There's a third as well, but I'm not going to dwell on it. And that is we need to have stable prices, which means a low and predictable rate of inflation, and we also need to have maximum sustainable employment. So I just showed you employment was doing pretty good. We're near our 2% inflation goal. This is the point. We're getting close. I know it doesn't feel like that all around the country everywhere, and we can talk about that because that's important too. But in the macro sense, we're probably pretty close, and that's what monetary policy has to address primarily. All right. So now for the thing you've been waiting for, post-election developments. So first, we have virtually no data that says anything about the economy post-election because it takes a few weeks at least for us, for the government agencies to compile the statistics and get them out. But we do know what the financial markets think, and so they've been pretty happy. I'm pretty sure I read almost everywhere that the forecast for the stock market was if Mr. Trump was elected, that the stock market would go down, and of course, like other predictions, that was wrong. And the stock market, this is the cumulative increase as of Monday afternoon, I guess, in the Dow Jones and the S&P 500 stock indexes, and they're up 4 or 5%. Not bad, right? It helps my 401k plan, and again, my happiness is what actually matters in the end. So that's happened, and then the 10-year Treasury yield, it's on the same scale, so it looks small, but it's actually up more than 0.5 percentage points since the election. That's a lot. That's a big move for the 10-year Treasury. Now, I think you could actually argue that the 10-year Treasury was surprisingly low prior to that. Some people said there was a bubble in the Treasury market. I don't know if that's true, but in any event, this is a move upward that reflects a number of things, probably having to do with government spending and possibly deficits, maybe inflation. I don't worry too much about that, but it could happen. We can talk about the taper trend later. So this is my last slide, and then we'll maybe talk about some questions. Just to talk about some of the post-election economic issues. So infrastructure spending is one thing that has certainly been talked about and might well garner bipartisan support. And so if it's done well, meaning we actually both maintain existing infrastructure and add infrastructure, all of which is an important complement to private business activity, that's a good thing, right? We need that. In fact, it's dumb not to maintain your infrastructure because it is a complement to private activity. So we really do need to do that. I think as an economist, I think it's foolish not to maintain your assets. I try to do that with my house. I don't let things go. I maintain them. I think it's even more important, amazingly, more important than my house is that the overall economy has the infrastructure it needs to operate. And so that would be a good thing to do. But the devil of that is to some extent in the details. It depends on what they actually decide to spend on and how they finance it, and what if there's a public-private partnership, what does that look like? So we don't know all that yet, but that could be a good thing. Immigration is a pretty hot political topic. It is the case that a significant fraction of labor force growth over the last 20 years has come, over the last 200 years, has actually 200, what was it, when we were 1776? So Anyway, so it's been quite a while that immigration has accounted, but even more recently has been a significant fraction of labor force growth. And so if the move is to cut immigration down significantly, that could cause shortages in certain types of jobs, certain types of workers in certain sectors. I would say that, in some cases, what some new immigrants to our country have worked in are jobs that others don't choose to work in. And so there could be a shortage there. That's an issue. I personally think immigration is a proud part of our tradition as a country, and I know that there are stresses and pressures that arise as a consequence of that, and that's part of what it means to live in the United States. But there, I almost sounded political for a second, so I won't go any further. I just think that's part of our history, so I think we have to be careful. Of course, we don't want people who mean to do us harm coming into the country. That almost goes without saying. But beyond that, I think immigration is just part of the strength of our national fabric. So that is a little political. Okay, on trade, economists often take the very facile position that trade is always good for the economy. And I think in the large it is. And I think actually curtailing trade too much will, one, make everyday household goods more expensive, and that hurts particularly lower income consumers and lower income households. But two, there are a lot of jobs that go to low income folks that are in export sensitive industries. And to the extent that we start to raise trade barriers and other people retaliate, we can lose jobs significantly from that. Now, I don't want to take the facile or simplistic position that there are no trade-offs involved in opening up trade and having relatively free trade. There are individuals who lose jobs as a consequence. I think the number is generally overstated, particularly with respect to NAFTA. There are studies that try to carefully estimate how much net job loss or increase arises from NAFTA, and generally the studies say there's a net increase. But there are individuals who do suffer when we open our borders. And I think we've been too glib and maybe not paid enough attention to those folks. And that's part of the reason we heard people complaining about that, because in some cases that's justified. So I still think trade is the right way to go. I think we can hurt the economy badly by restricting trade too much, but I think we need to pay attention to people who have been hurt by trade. So that's what that's maybe about. There are just a couple other things, of course. Healthcare. We were talking before, of course the Affordable Care Act is not perfect. There are some good things about it. There's some things that everybody likes. There's some things that some people don't like or would like to do a different way, and that's a political discussion, which I won't get into. I will say on the economic side, one thing that you can't do is only cut the sort of mandatory insurance part and keep the pre-existing conditions clause, because what that means is the insurance market will fall apart completely. So we call it adverse selection, but what it will mean is, so if you don't have a pre-existing condition and you're healthy, you don't get insurance. It's only when you get the condition that you get the insurance, because you're allowed to now, right? But that means the only people with insurance are sick, fairly sick, and older people disproportionately. And that's not a good way for an insurance market to work. Everybody who's tried to design insurance markets in any country has said we gotta make sure that the pool of insured includes both people who are reasonably healthy and young and people who are sick and older. Otherwise, the market doesn't work. So you can't cherry pick in that way. But they may find other substitutes for that. We will see how that goes. Can't wait. Tax cuts. Depends on who gets the tax cuts. I think from an economic perspective, the theory that if you only cut taxes for the wealthy, that all that's going to trickle down and poor people will benefit, that has very little empirical support. But it may be that there are tax cuts that are more even-handed across the board, and that may induce some additional spending. Adding these all up together, one thing we do need to worry about is what are the implications for the deficit. I don't think a good response is to say, well, the economy's just going to grow at 4 or 5%, so there won't be any deficit problems. Well, that's a high hurdle, right? We sometimes grow at 4 and 5%, as I showed you, when we're just coming out of a recession and we really have a lot of ground to make up, so you really should grow fast. Saying you're going to grow at 4 or 5% for the next 10 years, that doesn't happen. Hasn't happened so far. And I don't think that these sorts of policies, even maybe the good aspects of them, they're not going to be so stimulative that that's what's going to happen. So we will need to worry at some point about what are the deficit and debt implications of policies that are stimulative. Some of these things may help, but we, at both parties, I think now, are and need to be fiscally responsible, and so that's what that's about. So that's what I wanted to say today, and but I'd be happy to take questions about that stuff or anything else, and we still have some time, I think, right on the, yeah, terrific. Questions?
I've been coming to these lectures for probably 15, 30 years, and I've always appreciated the detail in the sense that we really understood when we had these talks how the national and sometimes the regional economy is doing. And that's why I'm so surprised by the election. And I'm just wondering, is there some rethinking going on in the Fed, among economists in general, about why so large a percentage of the population was not shown doing very well economically and feeling so disaffected? And what are the graphs that we could see in the future that may give us a better understanding of that huge percentage of our population?
So and I didn't show those today, but we could have, and that would be a great focus for a talk. And both economists, and others are aware of the income and wealth discrepancies that cut across race and wealth by income. So there are huge disparities there, and there's no question about that. That is a big challenge for the country, not because we want a flat income distribution, but it's a fact that there are kids born in the country today, millions of them over the years, who, through no fault of their own, it's just who were they born to and in what state, under what policies and so on, at what income levels, with what kinds of economic support, they don't get the opportunity really to participate in the economy in the way that I did. I had pretty good upbringing, childhood, economic circumstances. Lucky me, right? I was born on third base, and then I got driven home by somebody, so I never hit a home run, but I scored big, so that's great. That is not the case for lots of people in the economy. I think that was well known. I will say somewhat cynically that it was well known, and some attention was devoted to that plight for minorities and immigrants to some extent, although not much has been done about that in the last 50 years. What happened in this election is that it turns out, it is a fact, there are also some white people who are in those income echelons. They're not always there for the same reasons that the minorities are, because there's a very long pattern of this is history, I think, there's a long pattern of institutional preference for white families over non-white families, going back to Social Security, FHA policies, the GI Bill, all sorts of things, that has left minority families behind. But that said, there are white families who feel rightfully left behind, and from neither side of the aisle have we addressed either the white or the non-white income disparities in any significant margin. So I think that's a wake-up call. It's not that we need to rethink our models, and it's not that we haven't looked at the data before. We absolutely have. Part of what I do at the Fed is work on economic development in the New England region. So I'm at least aware, and we are doing things that we think actually will make a difference. But that is something the country needs to focus on seriously in a bipartisan manner is, look, folks who make $21,000 a year with a family of four, when that $21,000 includes federal and state and local income and other supports, you know, there is no way to survive. And that's like 20% of the population. And if you go up to 30%, they're a little above that, but not loads. And so those numbers are, embarrassing and unacceptable. And you can, of course, construct a narrative where you say, well, those are just people who are lazy and don't want to work hard. First of all, that's not quite true. Of course, there are lazy people everywhere. There are lazy people who make $500,000 a year, but and are just lucky. But if nothing else, I think a unifying principle would be the children who are born into those circumstances. The research shows that your initial conditions have a profound influence on your life course economically. And so I think everybody can agree that every kid born in the country should start off with a decent opportunity to succeed. And that's just not the case. And I don't mean that to be political. I mean that to be both personal and economic, that to me, that matters a lot. And so we need to get serious about addressing that as a country, as a bipartisan set of initiatives. And that will take time and resources. And we don't even know all the solutions, but there are ways to figure them out. So some of them involve research along with policy. It's part of what we do at the Fed. So thanks for the question. Yeah, you bet. There's stuff there, and I'd be happy to go through some of the data. We've actually generated some new data on wealth disparities at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. There's stuff on our website about that you might be interested in, but it depends. So, yeah, other questions before I get too passionate about whatever, about the state of poor people, which isn't a bad thing to be passionate about. Yep.
So you had a lot of employment statistics, and can you comment on job openings? I believe
Yeah.
the chart I've seen, we have as many job openings as we did back in 2000, the highest since then.
Yeah, job openings have come back quite
That's
nicely.
correct. How do you interpret that, and is it a sign of a big skills mismatch in this country?
So, back in the 2000s when we had that many job openings, so it's kind of what we care about then is what's the net employment that's generated out of the flows of people coming in and out of the labor force, the openings that arise, and how they get filled. So it's actually a good sign, I think, that there are many job openings, because prior to that, there weren't many job openings, which meant that firms were uncertain enough about the economy that they weren't even posting new job openings. Now they are. Those are getting filled, so that's the good news. If they weren't, you'd have people with either very long spells of unemployment or people who are just rising short-term unemployment, and we see neither of those two. So it's, that is a sign of health, as is the related statistic comes from the same source, that the quit rate, the rate at which people are leaving their jobs because they're secure enough they know they can find another job, that is also back up to a healthy level. So I see both of those things as healthy signs. But the last part of your question about the skills mismatch, so that's a harder thing to measure, but geez, we talk to enough people around all the regions in the US that every employer we talk to talks about something that looks like skills mismatch. And I think that's a real thing. I think that there are lots of folks, it's related to my earlier comment about education. There are a lot of folks who come out with, barely a high school education, and the high school education often, if they go to a community college, they spend 40% of their time, really, and that's not a made-up number, on remedial work to really get the full high school certification before they can go on to take the next set of courses. There's something not quite working there about how we're educating folks and who we're educating and whether they actually get the right skills. And there are ways to address that too. There are really great community college programs that link community colleges to high schools to employers, and there are examples of that, but they're not widespread enough, in my opinion, that equip people who are not going to go get a PhD in economics and talk about the abstract national economy, but are actually going to put together medical devices, say, right, which requires skill and training, and you have to know how both software and hardware work together to make stuff. Those are folks, a good high school graduate who has the right training could be doing that, but we don't have enough of that going on. So I think there is something to the skills mismatch, and that requires some careful thought and coordination between the private sector and the public sector to make the education work better. It's what wasn't in my slides, but great question, I love it. So, yeah.
I'm wondering regarding trade, is there any growth opportunities in terms of what it could add to GDP if we were to increase trade, or is it really we need those new innovations to start new markets, and that would help with the
Well, yeah, the question was, are there any growth opportunities to opening trade, or is it really just that we need to see more innovation to improve productivity growth along the lines that I discussed earlier? And the answer is, well, yeah. I mean, this is one of the reasons economists think that trade is good, is because it opens up new markets for everybody. And China, people talk about China as if they're going to kill us or they're a terrible country. China is a huge market. China is a developing market. China is an increasingly educated market, which also has huge challenges still ahead of it. They still have 400 million people who are doing subsistence agriculture who need to be brought into the mainstream. That's going to take them more than a week, and so more than 2 weeks. So they have developmental challenges there, some of which they're working their way through now. But from our perspective, no country is going to really be specialized and best at making everything. So they are a market for us as we are a market for them. We close those things off, then we probably limit overall global growth. So there are opportunities just through opening up export markets for sure. If there are things that can be done to improve productivity growth, I think that's great. And so I think we need basic investment, basic research in a variety of the areas I talked about before. Energy is one, it's not the only one. So that trade can help with growth, absolutely. And again, we got to be careful about, there are some losers in trade as well. Let's keep track of that. It's not that we spend no attention on that, but maybe we need a little bit more. Maybe that's part of what the election was telling us. Other questions? Nothing.
I have one, Jeff.
Yeah, Tim.
Looking at this more regionally, what would you consider to be the top 1 or 2 threats to the New England economy?
Well, so that's interesting. So, just looking at the statistics, the good news for New Hampshire, for example, is that you have one of the lowest unemployment rates in the nation.
It's a double-edged sword.
It is, right. I think the challenges for New Hampshire, it's not so much threats. I mean, there are things that could go wrong, but I think there are more challenges for New Hampshire. So you have like some other states in New England, you have a split. So Massachusetts, it's east and west. Maine, it's strictly north-south. New Hampshire, it's slightly more complicated. It's partly north-south. It's also some cities versus some rural areas. It's partly some parts of cities versus other parts of the cities. But there is a split economy, and it's not just the opioid epidemic, it's also the level of educational attainment and labor force participation in some of those cities. That's a challenge that the state faces because people will keep leaving the state if they don't see opportunities there, if they don't get the skills and training, and they don't have the industries located here that are going to employ them. I think there's a way to do that, and you probably know even more about this than I do, but I think we are seeing ways of making that work that could work for New Hampshire, for Maine, for Vermont, for parts of Massachusetts, for parts of Rhode Island for that matter. But they require a level of collaboration, for one thing, that we don't typically see. So this is one thing I do tend to preach about a little bit, is our research shows and practical experience suggests collaboration across nonprofit, private sector, the government sector, the public sector, is what's necessary to address these kinds of problems, because they're big, they're long-lasting, they're complex, and you need to collaborate across those sectors to design solutions that are actually going to work. You certainly can't leave the private sector out. They're the ones who employ most people, and they also know what they're looking for in terms of job. They often are left somewhat on the sidelines in terms of solutions. So that's not good. But the public sector has responsibility as well. So I think it's more the challenge is not, I don't see like a huge threat that, you know, some change in the Healthcare Act means that some parts of healthcare that New Hampshire benefits from in terms of employment are going to go away. I don't see that as a major threat. I think it's more the sort of secular challenges that New Hampshire and parts of Massachusetts and other New England states face. Those are more front and center for my money. Yep. Anything else? You are totally sated, both in terms of food and, yeah, sure.
Regarding the deficit, from your perspective regarding monetary policy, I mean, do we have to address this problem, or is this something that can keep getting pushed down?
The deficit problem?
Yeah.
So at the moment, people count the deficit different ways. So there's stuff, that's this issue that's part of the Social Security system that is not, that's not a burden on the U.S. or the U.S. economy and the financial markets. So the sort of marketable debt is around 70, a little more than 70% of GDP right now. Okay, so is that good or bad? You know, I don't know, what's the yardstick for that? So Japan's debt as a share of GDP is 220%, so 3 times larger. Japan's interest rates are incredibly low. That's because Japan has had incredible challenges for decades. So we don't want to use that as a justification for having a large debt. But I would say that overall, having a debt of 70% of GDP is not penalizing us in terms of credit market rates. So right, if the rest of the world were really worried about the size of our debt, like we can't pay it back, they would not accept yields of 2.3% on 10-year treasuries, right? They would. So if you were Greece, Greece, it's been up and down, but they pay a penalty on their debt relative to other countries because they are less fiscally secure. We do not seem to be in that position. Now, I'm not arguing we should try to get in that position, but what I am saying is, if you can find an investment that pays net positive social returns, such as infrastructure, and to do that you incur some deficit that will over time shrink as a share of your GDP, that's probably a good investment. Just, you know, incurring deficits for other reasons because we can't put our fiscal house in order is a bad idea. And most important there is that looking ahead 7 to 10 years, medical care, and you know, a large part of it is Medicare, but medical care generally is going to put the government into a much more significant deficit and debt position. And it's not that we don't want to provide good medical care to people. We do, and frankly, everybody in the country seems to love Medicare. It is the largest federal program by a large margin. But we're still not as efficient at providing medical care as we should be. And so in order not to grow the deficit for that reason, our next task forces should be looking not just at who's insured and who gets access to medical care, but how efficiently is medical care provided, because it's not. It is still in a number of ways behind many other industries in terms of efficiency. If you can do that, we can still provide high quality care at an affordable rate nationally without maybe swallowing the deficit. We got to start working on that now. Right? You can't say, well, wait till we get there. Now the deficit's 100, the debt's 100% of GDP. The deficit's 6% or 10% of GDP. Well, maybe we should start working on it. Well, it's way too late. So those are things we should start working on now, along with education. Those should be big priorities for the country. There are other priorities that are probably less pressing, and I won't name them, but you can imagine what they are. Okay.
Jeff,
Good.
thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Jeff, if you'll come back and join us again next year, I promise a much more high-quality name badge. Make a note of that, Valerie and Brianna. Thank you again, Kevin Boyarsky and Around Concord Magazine for sponsoring today's event. And we hope to see you all December 12th when we talk about infrastructure and Interstate 93. So thanks again for coming, everybody.